Imagine a peaceful morning at Pearl Harbor suddenly explodes with the sound of bombs tearing through the sky. A few years later, the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki flash with the blinding light of the most terrifying weapon humanity has ever created. In the midst of those horrifying moments, something else is quietly happening. A United States still struggling with an economic depression, in just a few years, rises to become the #1 superpower on the planet. Why does a war on the other side of the world end up shaping the way you live today? Why did the dollar become the dominant currency? Why do almost all major crises afterward, from the Cold War, the Vietnam War, to the world order we live in now, all bear the shadow of the United States in this video? You will not only hear familiar names like Pearl Harbor, Normandy, Hiroshima, but also see the bigger picture, how the United States turned its entire economy into a giant war machine. How a war pulled America out of the depths of the Great Depression and up to the peak of prosperity, and how, from the ashes of World War II, a new world order was formed, the very one we are still living in today. If you follow this journey to the end, you will understand why. In just 6 short years, America's position on the map of global power changed completely, and why. Even now, almost every major shift in the world cannot be separated from the word America. Sit down, turn off the distractions. We are about to step into the years when the world nearly destroyed itself, and at that same moment, a new superpower was born. In 1939, when the first shots rang out in Poland and World War II officially broke out, the United States was still standing on the other side of the ocean, like a silent giant watching Europe slowly sink into flames. In Washington, politicians, generals, and the American public were still haunted by the losses of World War I. They did not want their sons to once again spill blood on distant battlefields in Europe. Slogans like America First or Do Not Get Entangled in Other People's Wars appeared constantly in newspapers, speeches, and debates in Congress. Most Americans believed that the ocean was a natural wall strong enough to protect them from the chaos on the other side of the world. However, even as it tried to stand aside, the United States could not completely detach itself from the war. As early as 1940-1941, the Roosevelt administration was quietly looking for ways to support the Allies against Nazi Germany. Cargo ships carrying food, weapons, and supplies began crossing the Atlantic under the Lend-Lease program, helping Britain. The Soviet Union and other countries continued to resist Hitler's terrifying military machine. In American factories, production lines slowly sped up. Engineers and workers grew familiar with the sound of clanging metal, the constant pounding of presses and long shifts that stretched late into the night. Even before it declared war, America had already begun to pick a side. In that context, December 7, 1941 became a dark yet decisive milestone. That morning, the sky over the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii seemed calm as usual. Sailors and officers were getting ready for another ordinary workday. But not long after, the roar of aircraft engines tore through the air, followed by the deafening explosions of bombs. Japanese bombers and fighters suddenly appeared, diving down like steel arrows. Warships, battleships, and American aircraft lined up in the harbor became targets. Within a few hours, multiple ships were sunk or heavily damaged, and thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. Smoke, screams for help, and chaos engulfed the entire base. News of Pearl Harbor spread across America at breakneck speed. Major newspapers ran thick black headlines: "Japan attacks Pearl Harbor." On the radio, the deep, resolute voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt rang out, calling it a date which will live in infamy. In that moment, anger, pain, and national pride surged in the hearts of Americans. Those who had hesitated and wanted to stay away from war now clenched their fists. Understanding that the United States no longer had any choice but to step into a global conflict, on December 8, 1941, the United States officially declared war on Japan. Not long after, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies in the Axis, declared war on America, pulling the country into a conflict on 2 major fronts, Europe and the Pacific. From a nation standing aside, the United States became the center of global military effort. This war was not only a matter for generals on the battlefield, it became a total mobilization of the entire country, from politics, the economy, and science to the everyday lives of every family. One of the most profound transformations inside the United States was the shift in its economy. Before the war, America was still struggling to escape the shadow of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Many people were unemployed, factories closed, farmers devastated. But once war broke out, the demand for weapons, tanks, planes, warships, and ammunition surged without end. The federal government poured enormous sums of money into military contracts. Factories that once built civilian automobiles were converted to produce tanks and military trucks. Assembly lines that used to make refrigerators, washing machines, and consumer goods were rebuilt to produce plane fuselages, shell casings, and components for the war. Millions of new jobs appeared. American men who were not wearing uniforms on the front lines were pulling on work coats in the factories. Women, who had primarily been homemakers, now entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman worker with a red polka dot bandana, flexing her arm under the slogan, "We can do it," became an icon of an entire generation of American women. They assembled airplanes, welded ship hulls, inspected ammunition, and worked tirelessly to keep the home front strong for the front lines. For the first time, American society truly saw the power of mobilizing the entire population toward a single goal. At the same time, on university campuses, in laboratories, and at secret military bases, another front was exploding. The scientific front. Scientists, engineers, and technical experts were gathered into projects of unprecedented scale. Radar, early computers, encryption technologies, long-range bombers, aircraft carriers, and submarines were all rapidly improved. The peak of wartime scientific effort was the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program to build an atomic bomb. In the deserts of New Mexico and in the laboratories at Los Alamos, brilliant minds, many of them European scientists who had fled fascism, raced against time to create a weapon that had never before existed in human history. Across the ocean, U.S. forces began to appear on every major front. In North Africa, American troops fought alongside British and French forces against General Rommel's army. In Italy, they landed in Sicily and then pushed up the peninsula, facing harsh terrain and fierce German resistance. On the European front, the decisive event was the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Thousands of warships, landing craft, and aircraft, along with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, took part in this operation. The beaches of France became a brutal battlefield, but once the Normandy bridgehead was secured, the door to liberating Western Europe was opened. Step by step, the Allies, with American forces playing an ever larger role, advanced toward Berlin. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, the war took on a different face. Small islands and bloody battles fought for every stretch of sand and every hilltop. From Midway and Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, U.S. Marines and the Navy faced an opponent that was not easily subdued. Japan fought with a no-surrender mentality, meaning that every American advance came at a terrible cost in lives. Photographs of U.S. Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima and stories of kamikaze pilots crashing their planes into American warships were seared into the memory of an entire generation. Throughout the long war years, the United States was like a giant machine that never stopped running. Night after night, the lights of the factories shone brightly. On the railways, long trains carried tanks, ammunition, and provisions to the ports. In rural areas, people planted more vegetables, saved food, and collected scrap metal and waste paper for recycling into war materials. Propaganda posters appeared everywhere, urging people to save gasoline, cut consumption, and buy war bonds. Every household, whether in the city or in the countryside, felt they were participating in a collective effort beyond themselves, a total war involving the entire nation. In return, war also brought pain and contradictions. Japanese Americans on U.S. soil were suspected and discriminated against, and many families were sent to internment camps. African Americans, despite their significant contributions in the military and in factories, still faced segregation and racism. These stories show that even at a moment of great unity, America still carried deep social and racial fractures. Yet the shared experiences of working and fighting side by side during the war also laid the groundwork for powerful civil rights movements later on. By 1945, the course of the war had shifted decisively. In Europe, after opening the Western Front through Normandy and pushing German forces back, the Western Allies and the Soviet Red Army advanced toward the heart of the Third Reich from opposite directions. Berlin fell, Hitler committed suicide, and Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. After 6 years of war, Europe had become a continent in ruins, cities destroyed, bridges, factories, and railways heavily damaged, and tens of millions dead or missing. In the Pacific, even as defeat loomed, Japan remained stubborn. Its navy was nearly destroyed, its air force weakened, yet the militarist government still refused to accept unconditional surrender. American commanders understood that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would come at a horrific cost, with hundreds of thousands or even millions of casualties on both sides. In that context, the Manhattan Project reached its climax. The first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert in July 1945. The blinding flash and towering mushroom cloud from that test signaled that humanity had entered the nuclear age, an era both full of scientific promise and haunted by the possibility of self-destruction. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In an instant, both cities were almost completely destroyed. Tens of thousands of people died immediately, and tens of thousands more succumbed in the days and months that followed from injuries and radiation. The harrowing images from Japan shocked the world, but for U.S. leaders at the time, the decision to use atomic bombs was seen as the fastest way to force Japan to surrender and end the war. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history, officially came to an end. When the guns fell silent, the world did not return to the way it had been before the war. In Europe, piles of rubble replaced once bustling streets. In the Soviet Union, tens of millions had died and vast regions were devastated. In China, the long war against Japan had left society exhausted. Japan bore immense physical and psychological scars. In this context, the position of the United States was clearer than ever. Its homeland had suffered almost no direct attack, aside from Pearl Harbor and a few minor incidents. Its factories, ports, and infrastructure were intact, even strengthened by wartime production. The American economy, once crippled by the Great Depression, had ballooned thanks to the war. The United States now held much of the world's gold reserves, controlled a huge share of global industrial output, and commanded the most powerful Navy and Air Force. Young men carrying duffel bags back from Europe and the Pacific brought home scars on their bodies and minds, but also a new sense of identity. They felt they had helped save the world from fascism. The U.S. government passed the GI Bill, giving veterans support to attend college, buy homes, and start businesses. Millions returned to classrooms, entered technical, scientific, and managerial professions, and began building new lives. Suburbs sprang up. Houses lined new streets and highways expanded. The American middle class exploded in size, creating a strong social foundation for the country's economic power in the decades to come. As domestic life was rebuilt, the United States also stepped into a new role on the world stage. It no longer wanted to retreat into isolation as it had after World War I. The bitter lesson from withdrawing after 1919 convinced American leaders that if Europe and other regions were allowed to fall into chaos, similar wars would eventually erupt again. So the United States took the initiative in designing a new international order. It helped lead the creation of the United Nations, with headquarters in New York, symbolizing that the U.S. was now at the center of global efforts to resolve conflicts through diplomacy. Economically, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 laid the foundations for a new international financial system in which the U.S. dollar played a central role, pegged to gold, while other currencies were pegged to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank were created, largely under Washington's influence. At the same time, the Marshall Plan was launched, pumping billions of dollars into Western Europe for post-war reconstruction. On the half-cleared streets of France, Germany, and Italy, sacks of flour, machinery, steel, and equipment from America brought not only food and building materials, but also a message the United States was the patron of the free world, militarily. Even as it demobilized a large part of its wartime army, the United States maintained a powerful standing force, especially in the Navy and Air Force. It alone possessed nuclear weapons, a kind of power that forced every other great state to think twice. Meanwhile, the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union allies in war quickly deteriorated, marking the beginning of the Cold War. In this new tension-filled environment, America's overwhelming economic and military strength became even more crucial. It organized military alliances, established bases in Europe and Asia, and used naval power to control key sea lanes. From a regional power, the United States became a global superpower able to intervene in and influence developments almost anywhere in the world. Looking back at the period from 1939 to 1945, it is clear that World War II was the decisive turning point in America's rise. The war forced the United States to mobilize all its potential, human, industrial, scientific, financial, and political will, and in doing so, turned latent capacity into real power. Before the war, America had already been a large economy, but it was still haunted by isolationism and internal instability. After the war, these barriers were broken. The United States proved it could produce and fight on a scale never seen before, and it built an image of itself as a liberator in the eyes of many peoples in Europe and Asia. Of course, that image was never perfectly spotless. The atomic bombings, unjust treatment of minorities, and harsh geopolitical calculations after the war all left stains that cannot be ignored. But it is undeniable that during those brutal years, the United States completed its leap to become the world's #1 economic and military superpower. From the ashes of World War II, a new global order emerged, centered on two superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. For much of the 20th century, major global developments revolved around the power, choices, and ambitions of these two giants, with the United States at the heart of what was called the free world. To truly understand why World War II transformed the United States so dramatically, we have to go back to the 1930s, before the first shots were fired. When the Great Depression broke out in 1929, banks collapsed, factories shut down, farmers lost their land, and millions were thrown out of work. Long lines of people waiting for bread at relief centers and shantytowns known as Hoovervilles on the outskirts of cities became symbols of a shattered America. Faith in the American dream wavered. In this desperate situation, President Franklin D. Roosevelt came to power with the New Deal, using public spending, infrastructure projects, and financial reforms to revive the economy. By the late 1930s, conditions had improved, but the U.S. had not fully recovered. In a sense, World War II became an unexpected boost, forcing the American economy to run at full capacity. You could feel that transformation most clearly in a typical American industrial city during the war. By day, the streets were packed with workers, soldiers, trucks, and streetcars. At night, factory whistles marked the changing of shifts. Gates swung open and night shift workers hurried inside as yellow light spilled from windows. Blast furnaces and assembly halls. Not only big cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago were bustling. Previously quiet small towns also came alive. A new aircraft parts plant on the outskirts would pull in housing developments, stores, cinemas, and diners. In the harsh paradox of war, people found jobs, incomes rose, and a new rhythm of life took hold. Inside homes, war reached into daily habits. Many products were rationed: gasoline, sugar, meat, rubber. Every household had ration books and had to plan carefully. Nylon stockings became a luxury, and women sometimes used makeup to draw imitation seams up the backs of their legs. Children played soldier, cutting out pictures of planes and warships from newspapers. Families gathered around the radio to hear news from the front and went to the cinema to watch newsreels filmed at battlefields. Popular culture, from jazz to movies, took on wartime colors, filled with stories and songs that encouraged a spirit of unity and sacrifice. At the same time, America had to confront a difficult question: who was fully included in this national effort for African Americans. World War II was both an opportunity and a challenge. They joined the armed forces and worked in factories, but continued to face segregation and lower wages. Activists called for a double V campaign: two victories, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Massive migrations from the rural South to industrial cities in the North accelerated. After the war, many of those who had worn uniforms or worked in war plants formed the core of the civil rights movement, demanding genuine equality. The treatment of Japanese Americans during the war became a deep wound in U.S. history. After Pearl Harbor, fears of espionage and sabotage swept the country. The federal government ordered the relocation of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, including citizens born in the U.S., into inland internment camps. They had to abandon homes, shops, and farms, taking only a few suitcases and living for years behind barbed wire. There was no clear evidence of widespread espionage, yet the policy was carried out, reflecting the darker side of wartime paranoia. Decades later, the U.S. government would formally apologize and offer symbolic compensation to those who had been unjustly interned. Politically, the war changed how Americans viewed the role of the federal government. Before the New Deal and World War II, the federal state had been relatively limited, with many powers left to the states and the private sector. But in order to mobilize resources for a global war, the government had to intervene deeply in the economy, directing production, setting prices, rationing materials, and managing labor. People might complain about one regulation or another, but they also saw clearly that without such coordination, the economy would not function smoothly under emergency conditions. After the war, many wartime controls were lifted, but the imprint of a stronger federal government remained. It provided a base for expansion of social welfare, healthcare, and education programs in the decades ahead. On the global stage, American generals, diplomats, and policymakers had to learn to think not only in terms of the Western Hemisphere, but on a planetary scale. At conferences like Yalta and Potsdam, they sat with Soviet, British, and French leaders to redraw the map of Europe, divide occupation zones, and discuss the future of Germany, Japan, and many other regions. Their decisions would affect hundreds of millions of people behind closed doors. Heated debates raged how to prevent fascism from returning, while also limiting the spread of communism, how to rebuild shattered economies while protecting U.S. strategic interests in every option. The weight of American economic and military power was a decisive factor. One tangible expression of that power was the emergence of the dollar as the world's key currency. Before the war, the British pound had held that role, but conflict had drained Britain's financial strength. The United States, in contrast, had avoided physical destruction and amassed vast quantities of gold and foreign reserves. The Bretton Woods system, built around the dollar, reflected that reality. It was more than a technical monetary arrangement. It was a structure of power. As countries used the dollar for trade and reserves, the United States gained enormous leverage over global flows of commerce, investment, and credit. The Marshall Plan had a similar dual meaning. On the surface, it was a generous aid program to help Western Europe recover. Beneath that, it tied those economies more tightly to American markets and finance, reducing the appeal of Soviet-style centralized planning. Every bridge rebuilt, every railway reopened, and every factory repaired with U.S. aid was like an invisible thread binding Western Europe to the order led from Washington. For ordinary people in France, Germany, or Italy, crates stamped with the American flag were much-needed relief. For strategists in Washington, they were investments in a stable free world with the U.S. at its center. America's post-war military power was not just a matter of how many warships, planes, or tanks it possessed. It was also about its worldwide network of bases in Germany, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Italy, Britain, and elsewhere. American troops were stationed as both deterrent forces and symbols of security commitments. By controlling crucial sea routes from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the U.S. could protect the flow of oil and goods and exert pressure on potential adversaries. Some scholars describe this as a kind of base empire, not an old-style colonial empire, but a web of influence stretching across continents. Yet hard power always came with its own anxieties. Nuclear weapons, first seen as an ultimate insurance policy against enemies, became a source of dread. When the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, America's monopoly vanished. The resulting nuclear balance made global war less likely, but forced humanity to live as if on the edge of an abyss. Every crisis, every miscalculation carried the risk of catastrophe. In this way, nuclear strength both reinforced America's superpower status and placed on its shoulders the heavy responsibility of restraint and careful judgment. From a cultural perspective, World War II helped shape a new American identity. Soldiers from southern, northern, and western states served together in the same units, fought side by side, shared food, and faced fear together. They brought accents, habits, and local stories to the front and then carried back common wartime experiences. Those memories were retold in books, films, and songs and became part of the national psyche. The feeling that we accomplished something great together fed a powerful sense of national confidence and underpinned the leadership role the U.S. took on after 1945. The war years also highlighted the importance of science and education in America's rise. After the conflict, many European scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project or other wartime research chose to stay in the United States. Universities and research institutes expanded and were generously funded. The demand for engineers, physicists, mathematicians, and technology experts surged when veterans used the GI Bill to attend college. They were not just training for jobs, they were helping to create a society that increasingly valued expertise and knowledge. In the 1950s and 1960s, the scientific and technical base built up after World War II helped the U.S. lead the space race and dominate new industries such as civil aviation, electronics, and computing. From ordinary American street corners, diners serving hamburgers to veterans and their families, to the conference rooms where leaders debated the future of the world. The Post. World War II spirit infused everything excitement about new opportunities mixed with anxiety about new dangers. On one hand, the U.S. entered an era of unprecedented growth, with cars, refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions flooding middle-class homes. On the other, the shadows of the Cold War. Nuclear fear and limited wars in Korea and Vietnam reminded everyone that being a superpower meant not just wealth, but a constant series of hard choices. All of this, in a deep sense, began with the decision to abandon neutrality after Pearl Harbor and commit fully to World War II. Without the shock of 1941, America might still have become strong, but not necessarily the leader of the free world in the way history records. The scale and brutality of the war forced the U.S. to unleash its full potential, linking its economy, military, science, and society into a single superpower system. After 1945, that system did not disappear with the sound of the last gunshots. It was maintained, adjusted, and expanded, carrying the United States through the second half of the 20th century with a dominant role. When we look back at this period in American history, we can picture a chain of images: unemployed workers standing in bread lines during the Great Depression, assembly lines churning out tanks all night, women with oil-stained hands on factory floors, long troop trains heading for the beaches of Europe, the towering mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, aid crates stamped with U.S. flags on the rubble of European cities, a veteran's family receiving the keys to their first home in the suburbs. Each image is a fragment, and when pieced together, they show that World War II was not only a tragic chapter for humanity, but also the launching pad that propelled America from a struggling power into the most influential superpower of the modern age. Within that broader story, the role of individuals is often obscured by statistics, maps, and treaties, but history is woven from countless small lives. A young soldier raised on a farm in Iowa sees the ocean for the first time as he boards a ship for Europe. A girl in New York abandons dreams of acting to work in a radar components factory. A boy in California stands outside an appliance store, eyes wide as a new radio broadcasts news of victory. These lives, stitched together, form the World War II generation, a generation that endured depression, war, and then an explosion of prosperity. Their unique experiences made them both appreciative of peace and more willing to sacrifice to defend an order they believed in. From this period onward, global perceptions of America changed profoundly. For many Europeans liberated from Nazi rule, American soldiers were the ones who brought chocolate, cigarettes, canned goods, and smiles. For many Japanese, the presence of U.S. troops after defeat was both a source of humiliation and a gateway to a different kind of society. In some places, American interventions were fiercely debated or bitterly opposed, but whether loved or hated, the United States could not be ignored. After World War II, it became impossible to talk about the fate of many nations without mentioning America. Thus, the story of World War II and America's leap to superpower status is not only a tale of military victory or economic statistics, it is a story of how a nation was reshaped by crisis, tested in war, and pushed into a leadership role in a new world order. That story includes the light of courage, organization, and creativity, as well as the shadows of fear, prejudice, and violence. Only by seeing the entire picture can we understand why. In just a few short years, from 1939 to 1945, America's position on the global power map changed so quickly and so deeply. And why? Decades later, the world still lives in the shadow cast by those years. In the end, when we close the chapter of World War II, It feels as if we have just finished watching an enormous film in which America, once a hesitant supporting character, suddenly steps into the lead role at center stage. From the moment bombs fell on Pearl Harbor to the day victory flags were raised, the distance covered was measured not only in years, but in changes of perception, social structure, and the way Americans understood themselves and their role in the wider world. That is why, when people say World War II created the American superpower, they are talking not just about weapons, money, or territory, but also about a psychological and civilizational turning point. A nation that had wanted to avoid trouble was forced to learn how to live with global responsibility, a responsibility that still echoes in every international crisis today.